In the previous lesson, we added a new email property to our app component state. And then we wired up a method called handle email change to update that email state property based on the information in our event object, which of course is generated every time the user types a character into our input field. So whenever the user edits our input field, we update component state. But this relationship does not go in both directions. What I mean by that is whenever we update our component state, let's say through something like the setState method, that change to the component state will not automatically reflect in the input. So the direction of data only goes in one direction. When we activate our input, we change the component state. But when we change our component state, we do not modify the input. So let me show you this in action in the browser. So right here, as we saw in the previous lesson, I can type characters like TE into here. And you'll notice here in our React developer tools that the email property on our state is updated to have those characters. Well, as you may recall, in our React developer tools, we can manually update state properties right here in line. This is basically simulating the functionality of the setState method call, right? We are updating the current value of a given state property. So for example, here I can click into this string for my email state property, and I can update it to something like nonsense@email.com and click out of this field, and that simulates a setState method call. So we have successfully updated the component state. We have updated the email property. But notice that our input field right here still has our original characters. We have not actually updated it based on the component state. And the reason this is working like so is because we've only wired it up in one direction. We've said that whenever the user types a character into this input, we're going to trigger this onChange event, which is going to run the handle email change method, which is going to update the state, right? We've taken care of half of the formula, but there's nowhere where we've wired up the logic to say every time state updates, we want you to update the input, right? That is the problem. So here's how we can connect it in both directions. We're obviously going to need to take this email state property and use it somewhere to indicate that it should always update this input whenever the state changes. So right here at the top of our render method, we are destructuring our properties of state that we care about. Right now, we only have login mode, but here I'm going to destructure email as well. So I have whatever is the current value of the email state property always present in my render method. And remember, if any part of state changes, then this render method will rerun, and I'm going to have the most up-to-date values of login mode and email available right here. So I'm going to scroll down, and we're going to discover that on an input, we actually can provide a value attribute, or equivalently a value prop. And what this is going to be is the value populated inside that input. So what I'm going to put in here is, of course, going to be email. That is the destructured state property from above, right? So why is this logic going to work? Let's walk through the entire flow of what happens when the page loads. When the page loads, we start off with our starting initial component state. So the email property is set to an empty string. So right here, when we run the render method for the first time, our email is set to an empty string. So now, when the form renders, React is going to provide the value attribute, a value of an empty string. And that is what the input is going to be populated with. Well, the way that an empty string is going to reflect in the browser, of course, is with nothing being present right here, right? So nothing changes. Then the user is going to type into the input, which is going to trigger this onChange method to run. That onChange method is handle email change, which is right here. So React is going to generate an event object. We're going to take the event object's target.value property, which is what the user has entered, and we're going to update the state, right? Which means we're going to update email to be whatever character the user entered. Now, at this point, we haven't technically updated the actual input field in our browser because the input field's value is directly connected to the email state property. But within a matter of milliseconds, what happens? Well, whenever we call setState right here, we update the email state property, which means component state changes. So React says, I need to re-render. So it runs through this logic again, right? And at that point, email is now going to be equal to whatever the user has entered. Let's say it's the first character, so it's a string of one character. So then when React looks at this and says, okay, what has changed? What do I need to re-render? It finds this input and it says, oh, the value property or the value attribute was previously set to an empty string. Now the new email state property has a single character, so I need to update this to be that new character. And once React does that and re-renders that change, then that character appears here in our actual input. So it kind of goes through the entire flow. When the user types a character here, we update component state, then component state forces a re-render, which updates the value attribute right here to reflect what the user has entered, right? So it kind of goes through the entire cycle of talking to React and then letting React dictate the next render. So we've kind of separated the browser part of it and let React be fully in control of the input. React is fully in control of determining the value that the input is going to hold or render to the screen, and that is going to be set by a state property on our React component, and that React component state property is going to be updated by a method that runs, again, within our React component. So this is an example of what we call a controlled element in React, because React is fully in control of how this input or this element works. It's in control of how it changes. It's in control of the value that is within it, how it's read, how it's written, etc. We have moved away from the older paradigm of much more manual, explicit, kind of hard-coded logic, right? We're not going to submit a form here and say, find the first input with a type of text, reach into it and find its own value. We don't need to do that because all of that data is now being tracked within React, and React is now responsible for updating the screen and the DOM with things like the updated input with the updated value. It is fully in control of all the data flow. So because React is in control, we call it a controlled element. This input right now is a controlled element. So let me show you how this is going to work. So we still have the functionality that we had previously. So if I type a character into here like TE, you'll notice that our email field here is updated, the state property of email. And you'll also notice if I go into here and I provide something totally different, like nonsense, and I click out, notice that now that change in state reflects in our input on screen. Once again, that's because this updating of state triggers a rerunning of the render method, right? And so right here, value is now going to be set to the email state property, which is now nonsense. And so React says, okay, the value of this input should be nonsense. That's what I'm going to render onto the screen. So the user has the exact same experience of typing regularly and seeing that update, but behind the scenes, we're now managing all of the actual input field and the state within it using our React component. All right, so that is the value attribute, or equivalently the value prop on our input element right here. We simply connect it to a piece of state, and then we provide the way that that state is going to update by providing a handler method that is going to call setState to actually update that specific property that we care about. All right, so now that we have a better understanding of this kind of logic for this input, we're going to practice with our other available inputs on the page, the password field and the confirm password field in the upcoming lessons. So I'll see you there.